So today we're going to be taking a look at the latest watch release from Haim. It's a watch brand that I reviewed before. Just to note, Haim did send me this model to review, but I don't get to keep it, but they also don't get to review the footage in any way, so take that for what you will. Let's get into this pretty interesting watch. So we have a diameter of 38 millimeters, lug to lug of about 45, height of 12 millimeters, and a lug width of 20. Some other general specifications, we're going to have the NH34 movement beating away in here through a nice customized rotor there. We do have a sapphire front with 5 layers of anti-reflective coating. They don't state whether that's on the front or the back, but I think it's on the underside, so let's go with that. We do also have 15 meters of stated water resistance with just a regular push-pull crown there. The watch is in full stainless steel. It comes on this leather strap provided by Haim. You can also have an optioned beads of rice bracelet for an extra $100. And retail, this is going to be starting at $6.99 for early bird pricing and $7.99 for regular full retail. So looking at the dial here, and this is absolutely the star of the show, this is kind of my first time with hands-on with a dial that really just looks like this, has this kind of world continent style motif on it, and I think it's done pretty well here. The actual continents themselves are raised, they have some topographic feel about them. It is multicolored, and I think there are just a lot of tones on the dial that you typically don't see, and they work well together because it's very natural and earthly. It's just nice to see a world time watch that also shows the world in a sense. It is a cool and nice artistic touch. The hands are apparently inspired by a compass, so it has that tie-in to traveling in the sense of, you know, cartography and mapping out the world. So it has a cool little, in a sense, hidden detail in there with that inspiration. We do have Roman numerals at the 12, 3, 6, and 9, and then regular circular kind of rounded raised hour markers for every other marker there. We don't have any seconds track to speak of. This is not something you can really tell time perfectly to the minute or to the second, but based on how you get to tell so many different time zones throughout the world, at least you can tell within the hour and within 5 minutes of the actual minute. We of course have this GMT hour track on the inner bezel just outboarding the dial there, done in black and white, one denoting pretty much day, one denoting night, which I think is a pretty cool touch. And then on the where you would normally find a rehat or internal bezel situation, we have this very nicely curved and angled world time track, executed pretty well. It doesn't look overly cluttered, which is actually pretty nice. Also, I do love the cone nature about it, just because it does draw your eye into the dial. It actually makes you focus a lot on that GMT hour track as well, because of all the arrows that are on top of that world track, really pointing down. So most of the time your eye is being drawn there to be able to actually read what hour it is in that region, which is nice. What I find interesting about this watch is the branding is done incredibly subtly. It's at the very bottom 6 o'clock near that Roman numeral. We basically just have Haim Watch Co. in Chicago, Illinois scripted down there. Very small, very out of the way, something you would not notice on first impression. I really thought it was almost an unbranded watch at some point, or an unbranded dial at least. And I appreciate that they did that because, again, the main focus of the dial here is the world time complication, is that world style continent motif. It looks good, it looks interesting, that's what draws your eye in, and they didn't do anything to really take away from that. I think it's a great looking dial. I love too the tiny little touch of Chicago up here being in red. Of course, the brand is based there, so it just tie into the hometown where the watch is made, and I think that's a pretty cool aspect overall. So taking a look under macro, we can see how fun this dial looks up close. This definitely gives the feel of some kind of like old map or some kind of wrinkled globe you would have in a classroom or something like that. It has a very cool, almost oil painted type texture to it, and I really stylistically like what they did here. Almost in a way it becomes unfocused the closer you look, but again at wrist view it just becomes a nice beautiful fully in focus picture. From what I understand, the dial is made by having like a mold that's pressed in relief to the dial, and then the printing is done on top to give it the actual color tones. Again, I think it's executed very nicely here. I like the depth that's created. I like the multiple layers and just kind of the rivers and valleys, and I guess you can say continents that you get on the dial, and it complements the watch really well. The gold markers do have a nice shine to them. I do love the roundedness of this more, I guess you can just call it button-shaped marker. It adds a lot of light play and reflection because it is just a completely curved surface, and I think that is super underrated. We don't see that marker used enough in modern watches that has a very kind of elegant old world feel. And I just love the way it looks. It's very classic. It doesn't take up too much space on the dial, but looks premium. Looking at the very unique compass-shaped hour handset, really nice shape to them, very unique, very stylized, really. And I appreciate that they went the extra mile and made something really, really unique here. I would have liked to see a tiny bit of curvature maybe, but it's really not a deal breaker. At least it does reflect the light nicely in its fully polished state. Of course, we do have like a little bit of scratching and dirtiness to the hands, but this is a prototype model. This isn't meant for full sale. And even then, it's still done pretty well, so I don't imagine the production models will look really much worse and hopefully much better. Looking at that outboard track there, the printing is done incredibly well. I like that the actual cities have a little bit of depth to them. They're not just really flatly printed. It just looks great in my opinion, very crisp, very clean. A nice defined separation between the actual GMT track and the world time track. It gives a little bit of separation, a little bit of just extra depth to the dial that wouldn't have been there otherwise if they were too close together. The printing on the GMT track much flatter overall, so I don't think that's really a bad thing. I do think it would look a little bit nicer if it was a little bit thicker printing, but it's really not a deal breaker, especially because the cities are printed so well. Nice dial, not much to complain about really, and I think on macro it pretty much holds up. Taking a look in natural light, you can see at extreme angles you do get a lot of glare from that crystal, but most of the time it's very readable. The colors are very saturated and they don't look any duller in natural light. That does come together and look pretty nice outside. The hands really pop. The gold kind of at certain angles is very bright and yellow and sometimes a more subtle, almost silver tone, but complements really well the tone on the dial. When you move into natural light, however, we're getting a much more silver-ish feel from those hands, a little bit more of a dull gold, and a much more poppy, bright feel from all the other colors on the dial. It looks great in natural light. You can really feel the matte motif a lot more. The dial texture comes to life a lot more outside, and I do think it just holds up well. So moving on to the case of this watch, and arguably while not as interesting as the dial itself, I think it's still pretty good. We do have the same Corne d'Avache style inspiration that we had with the previous release they had with the guilloche dial. Here, although it's done in full stainless steel with mainly high polished surfaces, we have a little bit of brushing on the bezel just to kind of draw your eye in a sense. Everything's high polished, but then the brushing focuses and then you get to just focus on the dial eventually. So that's the main star of the show here. We do have some nice details here. We have this huge chamfer here along the side of the lug that doesn't really continue into the case because it's almost like having welded on lugs here. We have a basically three-piece style case with the bezel, the mid case, and the case back all kind of just sandwiching together. The mid case is a little bit on the bulky side, and I feel like they could try to slim that down a little bit and hide some of the height somewhere else, but just a small little point there. One thing I will note is that compared to other Corne d'Avache styled cases, these are much, I guess you can say, smaller and more dainty type lugs. They're a little bit flatter overall. You can obviously tell too, they have this like a little bit of a jagged edge where they meet the case. Maybe jagged's not the right word, but they have a little bit of a disconnect right there. Like they're just not fully seated into the case itself, which I think is an interesting look. It's almost like it has an initial lug frame that the watch body is then dropped into, which can look cool, but I do think the lugs themselves need to be a little bit beefier. They're a little bit on the small and dainty side, which I don't think perfectly matches the kind of almost robust roundness of the case itself. And then one thing to note too, it's like kind of hard to see. If I zoom in a little bit, you can see the crown there has this like central tubing that attaches to the case, and then the knurling starts over here with the actual quote-unquote crown itself. But that is just the part that meets the case itself. It doesn't really feed into the case, it just sits on top. So it seems a little bit odd. It almost gives an appearance of being a screw down crown that's not screwed in, but it's just a regular push-pull crown. So I do think that's something that can be refined either by making the crown larger or maybe by making a screw-down crown and adding threading to hide that more. That just seemed like a little bit of a weird thing that really drew my eye in. Operating the watch itself is actually pretty nice overall. The winding is kind of just a classic, I would say, nicer feeling Seiko movement. It's not super screechy, not super winding, but not buttery and amazingly smooth either. When you pull it out to the first position, one way towards you, you have the date, which is a ghost date. It's just under the dial. It's not visible, which I definitely prefer. I don't think there's a lot of ways you could have integrated it that made it look sleek. Maybe you could have had it at the 6 o'clock, but I don't know where the date framing would end up being compared to the rest of the dial element. So I'm okay with foregoing it here. If you go the opposite direction away from you, you're then jumping the GMT hour track. And basically just the way you would set this is you would find out, okay, what do you want to be your main time zone or your home time? Typically you put that at 12 o'clock. So like here we have Chicago. Let's say it is, 1 p.m. in Chicago. So we'd go on the 24-hour time scale, set that to 13 for 1300 hours. So there we have that there. It's basically now 13, almost 1400 hours, basically 13 and a half because that's where the minutes hand is. And as time changes, it'll update. Thankfully, this track here doesn't change. You can move it with this crown here to be able to actually shift that track so you can set whichever time zone you want to be your main focus, which is nice. You don't have to have Chicago there, but if you move it, Chicago will still be in a different color because, again, that's where the brand is made, and I do think that's still a cool touch. One thing to note is, at least for the review model, this crown doesn't always work well. It's a little bit hard to move. It has the same feeling of like, is it supposed to be a screw-down crown? Is it supposed to be a push-pull crown? But it is just static on the case, and you just either push it up or push it down. And sometimes it doesn't catch quite in the gears or whatnot, and it's not quite turning the track itself. I think that's just a kind of mechanical issue of the prototype, and hopefully that's not how the production models are. Looking quickly at the case back, pretty much no frills, just some text here along the outboard. We do have this beautiful customized, what they call the Atlas rotor, just like, a world rotor. I think it looks great. It's a very unique look and customization we have here. Of course, the NH movement, not really much to look at, nothing to write home about. So I think this rotor is a nice way to spruce it up and make it look more premium. So moving on to how this watch wears, earlier I was wearing this cool little AliExpress watch called Farsute or Farsute. Either way, cool case shape and fun dial here. So here we have the Haim sitting on my 6.5-inch wrist, and as you can see, wears amazingly well. It's nice to see another sub 40mm watch just in general, and also a sub 40mm watch with such complications that doesn't look too crazy busy. I think it just wears well, pretty short lug to lug. It isn't overly thick, so it doesn't really wear too high up off the wrist. Could definitely fit under a dress cuff if you needed it to. Very comfortable, no sharp edges overall. There you are with more of a side view. You can see it sits pretty flush to the wrist, doesn't really rise up at all. There's no kind of sunlight shining through or anything like that. It is just a pretty comfortable watch to wear, and thankfully on a very comfortable strap, which Haim provides themselves. Of course, Haim signed buckle. This, I believe, is a French Epsom leather strap that Haim makes themselves now. It's going to have quick release. I believe they might add branding in the future, but as of now, unbranded. But very comfortable, very small break-in period, pretty supple, pretty much right out of the box. No extra padding, which I really like on straps. This is a strap I would easily pay $60 to $100 for, so definitely good value here with the strap option and something you don't have to replace immediately. However, if you do replace it immediately, we can have some fun. This is a beautiful strap from Has No Bounds. It has this almost pearlescent, iridescent type sheen to it. There's multiple other tones hiding in here. Almost has this aged and distressed feel about it with these other kind of browner spots in the leather. I think it definitely suits the color tones on this watch pretty well. Of course, plays off the greens, the kind of almost darker tones play off some of the browns, and it gives an overall aged feel to the watch, which kind of a vintage map styled watch tends to already have. Looks pretty good in my opinion, pretty much right at home. Adds a little bit more fun than the original kind of subtle strap that it came with, and kind of darkens the watch out overall. It doesn't add so much kind of bright and light tones to it. Next, if you want to class it up a little bit and maybe like match the rotor for some reason, there's this beautiful alligator grain from Delugs, very flat, just kind of like the original strap, unpadded. But I think it looks great, brightens up the watch a little bit, and definitely makes it dressier. Pretty good look to this overall, I would say. Again, I don't think those lugs do the watch complete justice. I think they need to be a little bit thicker, a little more defined, and potentially a little bit more rounded. They do seem a little bit subtle compared to every other element on the watch. But with that being said, it does point down nicely, it does plant the watch well, and I think this strap looks pretty good on it.
Next, if you want to give a little bit more of an explorer feel to this explorer styled watch, we can add this more canvasy, linen-y type strap from Monstraps. Again, a little bit more of a texture that otherwise wouldn't have been there, but not too intense or in your face that it overshadows the dial. And then just complements well. Super comfy overall, really nice on wrist, pretty monotone with that stitching that pretty much matches the same color. I think this looks great. And last but not least, a nice classic white silicone strap. I think it looks good on the watch, nice and bright, a little bit more fun, a little more summer. Super comfy. I really like how nice and just clean, ungrained, simple this strap is, and just complements pretty much everything.
Pros and cons of this watch. I think one of the biggest pros is really just going to be how unique the watch is. I do love all the variations they did in terms of the colors, the air, land, and water, and just how interesting and I think beautiful those dial colors look. They also aren't the most traditional of colors. It's not the typical black, white, and blue you see with most watches, so it kind of has a reason to be in your watch box, which I like. But beyond that, I just think, again, the watch is very unique. We're not seeing a world time complication, nonetheless, at this price point, really ever. The whole matte motif on the dial is awesome. The fact that they use so many different little colors that just kind of bring life to the dial is amazing. Kind of following on from one of those points, I do think the value here is awesome because, I mean, at the end of the day, you're getting a world time for a price we've never really seen it at, or at least I've never seen it at. Realistically, the cheapest world timers I could find are like Young Hands did one for around like $2,000. I think Ball makes one for about $3 grand. There was one made by Mito for around $1,300, but it was also kind of like a dive watch compressor style that was very busy, really not good looking in my opinion. So realistically, again, we're getting a complication here. You usually don't see under really $3 grand, $2 grand if we're really stretching it. And it's done here, I think, amazingly well. I do think it's just fantastic they were to pack this all in at that $799 price point, $699 if you get on it early. Yeah, I mean, I really don't think there's really much out there like this watch. Kind of a small point, but I do think it speaks to the watch in general as well. The leather strap that it comes with is fantastic. It's been like that for every Haim that I've reviewed so far. Really great quality, super comfortable, and something that most brands don't get right. There's very few brands that have a comfortable strap straight out of the box, and Haim does. And it's just one of those things where I feel like it shows there's attention to detail being paid here. It's not a just random off-the-shelf strap thrown onto the watch and going, hey, I made the watch, I'm phoning it in here. It's every little detail is paid attention to and done, in my opinion, to a good standard. Now moving on to cons, and while I didn't personally find many with this watch, one of the bigger ones for me is going to be the case in general. It's going to be personal preference. I do think this case shape can be refined and can be better, and it's not an aesthetic I'm in love with, just because I do think it's a little dainty, a little bit thin, and can be a little bit more beefed up in general, more rounded, more prominent around those lugs. It just feels like it's 75% of the way there, and I want it to be 100. So this may be something that's not an issue for you. You may love the case style outright, and that'd be great, and really there'd be no issues with the watch otherwise. So that's just something that I really focus on and something that really grabs my attention. The dial's amazing. I think the case shape is where it needs to be refined just a little bit more. As a small note too, I think the crown is a little bit of an issue on this watch, mainly just the way it's designed. As I mentioned earlier, you have that like tiny little portion that is between the knurling and the case, and that makes it feel like the crown stands out even more from the case than it actually does, and visually it just looks odd. You can just knurl the whole crown and get rid of that or something similar to that, but I think it looks odd as it stands. Other than that, the only other really con that I can think of is mine did have a slight, I would assume, a mechanical issue when you were trying to adjust the world time track. It really did not catch well. I showed that in the video. I do think that's probably something that's going to be fixed in production, but if it's not, something to keep in mind that might be an issue or might be a problem that's happening with this movement. I really don't think it will be, but I can only base it off what I have in front of me. But also to keep in mind, the brand does say they have a 2-year warranty with the watch, so if you do have an issue like that, I'm sure they'll take care of it. Final thoughts on this watch, and I was actually pleasantly surprised when I first got sent the press briefing for the watch. I was not overly interested, but I thought might as well try it out, see what it's like in person, see if I enjoy like a world time watch in general. I just ended up enjoying how visually different it was from everything else that I've really ever looked at. It has that beautiful world motif, it has these lovely colors on it, it has that beautiful 3D textured dial. There's so much depth here, there's so much attention to detail, there's a lot to love and a lot to look at, And kind of one thing I didn't even mention, especially focusing on the dial, I love how at certain angles the dial looks like almost a lower resolution map in some ways. It takes on this more grainy field effect and it gives it this more just aged and kind of historical feel to it, in my opinion. I may be completely wrong, but that's what I get out of it. So I think other people would agree in some sense. And at the end of the day, it just looks cool. It's nice to see a brand out there doing different things. This isn't just another dive watch. This isn't another quote unquote Rolex ripoff. It's really going along with its own grain, its own design language. And especially with this release, I think focusing on a price point that's really fair. Is this gonna be the best value for money watch in the world? No, not at all. But I do think if you like what's going on here, it's not going to be easy to find a comparable watch to it. You might be thinking of something like, let's say, a Trasco or a Laurier that is $100 or maybe $200 cheaper, but is, you know, fairly derivative overall. I guess at the end of the day, it's kind of the question is like, what value do you put on originality? And I do think the value here is justified. Anyway, those are just my ramblings. Thank you as always for watching. Let me know what you think down below. Let me know if I'm right, if I'm wrong. What is interesting about the watch to you, what you think they should do better. If you end up picking up one, let me know. Hope you got something out of the video, and I will see you in another one.